automated way. We'll talk about reports, then we'll talk best practices, scenarios, and prerequisites. And then we'll finally conclude that with Q&A session. So, what is a privileged identity? Most of us know that, just to set the context, an identity which has legitimate access or administration rights to sensitive information on mission critical systems. So these are not just these are not necessarily the personal accounts or what we call individual accounts. Often these are shared between multiple users. So examples, you have root administrator, you have DB2 admin, you have ITIM manager, sec master, and so on and so forth. These are powerful accounts to a system, and they can, there are problems all around it as they are quite powerful. So we'll go to the next slide. What are the problems around privileged identities? So I've categorized in 3 areas. So let's go with the default system identities. You have root, administrator, sec master, DB2 admin, and so on and so forth. So these are powerful accounts which are usually shared for convenience by the administrators. Now that brings a challenge with accountability. Who really used it and the actions performed under it. So accountability is a problem here. So next, for the user-defined system identities, they're like application identities. You have operational identities to do your operational activities. Then you have identities with system-level privileges. So most of these applications do not do the application level audit, and they don't log that information. And if they do, they are not uniform. And even they are doing it, they are not centralized. So then the correlation becomes very difficult. So that's one of the issue there. Next, you have individual user identities. Yes, we are solving accountability, but we are having huge number of IDs out there generating and maintaining that leads to identity proliferation. So just to summarize, these IDs could be misused and shared for convenience, resulting to loss of accountability. Next, privileges to individual identities lead to identity proliferation, which is a cost, and there are some other points we'll discuss down the line. We have a focus slide on that. Password safety violations due to strong password strength and policy. Since these are privileged IDs, companies tend to enforce strong password strength, resulting into administrators not remembering these passwords. They end up writing it down, sharing it across in a flat file or an Excel, etc., making it more unsecure. The last one is difficult to ensure compliance and the audit. So these are the problems around privileged identities. So what damage can be done by using privileged identities? Establish new user definitions. Now, when we say this, privileged ID, I could set up a user in such a way that it gets unnoticed by any of the identity management policy enforcements. So let's say your identity manager is configured to certain user schema to detect if it is non-compliant. What a misuse can happen is I could change the schema of a different type and make sure it is not under the radar. It's under the radar of identity management. So I could have my own password policy and get away from this. Because I am a privileged user, I could do that. So if I'm a root user, I could create a new ID which does not come under this policy. So this is one which can result into security loopholes. Yeah, for user convenience it's good, but you're leaving a loophole which is a problem. So that's the damage you create by having several IDs of that sort in the environment. Next, change other users' capability. So if I am a privileged administrator, I could grant more privileges to other user outside the process, which is a problem, which makes it into misuse and non-compliant. Especially when you consider change management, there are several alternate ways people could go in and make changes without following the process, and resulting into several downtimes or outages because of abrupt changes to the environment. Next, you have create other privileged user without any traceability, accountability. It results into elevated risk now. Disabling, denying access to service required by a user. This will result in impact of business operations. So that's about changing the user capability. Next, you could, as a privileged user, you could have access to this sensitive information. You could misuse that information. It could have a financial impact. So that's very much important these days, because there is a lot of IP related information being leaked out. It really impacts companies from their shares wise and financial losses. So next, change audit logs. I could, as a privileged user, I could tamper with the files. I could change. I could remove the footprint by just deleting the logs or nulling the logs. I could do that. So those are the damages one could do using privileged identities. So technically, privileged identities may, by their intent, own a system completely. They could do anything with that. So next, we talked about privileged identities, problems with them, now problems around them, and then now let's talk about different models followed by most of the organizations and what are the issues around it. So first model is everyone in an administrator role has identity on every system all the time. Let's say there are a group of administrators. Now all of them gets access on all of the servers, which is a problem. You have identity proliferation. You start creating IDs as many as those administrators on various servers. Second, you have impact on your productivity because you need to remember those many servers, your IDs, your credentials or your passwords for those servers. You need to make sure all are changed, updated, compliant, etc. Increased security risk. There are more IDs with privileged access. Yes, of course, the risk goes higher. Management cost increases because you have to make sure those are compliant. You have to do all those revalidations, which is a cost. Disabled, terminated user identities. Now here, when you have individual IDs in the environment, whenever a person moves out, most of the companies do not delete these IDs from a policy standpoint. They keep it for a certain period of time and then remove it. Till that period, there is a risk of having these IDs in the environment. Now this happens because your individual IDs are there in the environment with privileged access. Next, business continuity impact. There are several instances where IDs have been deleted, which are tagged to be terminated, but deletion of those IDs bring down the environments. So that's how it impacts business continuity. So this is, again, these are the issues around the first model. Second, everyone in administrator role has access to a single user ID credential for ease of administration. So that's where we are talking about shared IDs. So there are privileged IDs like you have root. Root might be shared across administrators because it's the convenience they can use it. Still you somehow could manage with sudo access, but there are systems where you can't have sudo type of access. You will need this ID to be shared. Network devices, there you need to have these IDs shared between the teams who are supporting it or administrating it. So accountability challenges show up because you don't know who really logged in at that time using that ID and did the changes. Finally, your log shows administrator did the change. So that's the issue. Next is password management and distribution challenges. Let's say there are 10 administrators having access to one ID. Now, the moment the password is changed, you need to update all of these users with the new password. Now, how are you going to distribute it? Emails or whatever. Again, there is a risk there. The other thing is, if one person out of 10 administrators leaves out, you're supposed to change the passwords. Now, how often that is being done? If it is not done for the convenience, that person moving out still knows the credentials. There are ways he could loop in or he could, hack into. So that's another issue. Scope of non-compliance. You have traceability issues, operational risk, because now in this model you're giving, let's say there are 10 people in administrator role, all have access to this ID, which means irrespective of skill level, you are still giving the access to them. There's no approval or review process to really control that and see if this person can really use this ID in a appropriate way and understands the risk. So that's a problem there. So you still have a risk, lack of auditing. So all these problems comes with this model of having administrator role, people in a administrator role to have access to the single user ID. Now, the third model, pseudo person identity challenges. So this is the most followed model where the IDs, let's say these privileged IDs are tagged to one pseudo person object, and this person object is being owned by several people. Now, you'll have delegation challenges. You have accountability is a problem because you still, you have all these IDs tagged to one person object. Delegation becomes a challenge. Accountability is still a problem. You have a risk of software limitations because you have like thousands and thousands of IDs being tagged to one person. So the software has a limitation there. So you'll have issues with the softwares also. Role policy definition gets convoluted because at one side you are saying if a person falls into this role, he gets access to the ID. The other side, you are tagging all these IDs to a person object. So it's kind of a mixed setup when you have the pseudo person identity. Next, you still have issues with SOD policies or the segregation of duties policies. Now, you can't have a control out there because at one side you are having these IDs owned by the pseudo person, which is in turn delegated to a person, plus you have a role. When you have a role to this delegation, you can't really do the segregation of duty check. You need to have a role-to-role check. So that's the problem with pseudo person identity. Next, we go with the business as usual approach. That is the scenario where you have accounts lack clear responsibility. It's not structured. Sharing privileged ID or accounts password without adequate controls. No audit trails. It talks about administrator did it or done using root ID or some generic ID and not the specific user. Difficult to maintain good password management practices. So as I mentioned earlier, usually privileged IDs have elevated password strength. So that results into privileged users ending up writing it on paper, docs, Excel, and sharing it with the teams. And the last thing is lack of monitoring. You don't have adequate monitoring for these IDs, these privileged IDs in a business as usual approach.